Hello, this is the PCC Treasurer, Dan Snape. This is a recording of the finance report from the last financial year in 2020. It's meant to be for the annual parish church meeting that will be held later on this year, but it's being uploaded online now to allow people just to familiarise themselves with the situation with the accounts so that they can get a chance to start to think about what this might mean for the church overall. So what we have in here is a 6-slide presentation which takes you through sort of the formal accounting and then helps to contextualize the situation a little bit and then let you know where we are today in June 2021. So on to the first slide. So the 2020 accounts were signed off by the PCC earlier on these years. These are now the accepted and signed off accounts. And when we look at it compared to 2019, you can see that our overall income was down by £44,000 when you compare 2019 over here with where we are with 2020. Now, if the income was down, that's quite a challenge, of course. That was all due to COVID, predominantly down to the fact that the church was closed and we lost a lot of our income to the plate. That's the cash and cheques that people put into the donation bag. However, the parish giving scheme stayed rock steady all the way through the year, and that made a really positive difference. Another reason why the income was down is related to the lack of a gift day in 2020, which we hope to rectify in 2021. Expenditure between 2019 and 2020 was roughly the same. You can see there it's just under £280,000. So the overall effect, when you look at it compared to the slight overspend we had in 2019 of around £3,000, we've had just about £47,000 of an overspend in 2020. So looking at the balance sheet, the place where you'll notice that we had the biggest impact was actually the bank balance. When you, and there'll be a picture on this later on, you'll be able to see how we dropped from a sort of a stable balance of around £100,000 and how we saw that steadily decline through the year as we tried to keep things going. We did pull all sorts of different levers and implement measures to try and decelerate that decline, but nothing was really going to stop it happening overall. So the outcome is that right now we're in a bit of a challenging financial situation, and these numbers represent, of course, both the combination of St Michael's Church and the Ascension Southam. So that's an important thing to take away, because some of these funds lie with Southam overall. So what were the cost drivers? Things that sort of really impacted the accounts. Well, in 2019, parish share was a key increase of about 10%. So we paid the full commitment in 2020. That was important to make sure that the diocese remained on an even keel with some predictable income for the year. And then in 2019 we also had a quinquennial, so the works cost around £16,000. That was work that we hadn't necessarily planned or prepared for, and we now have a savings plan in place to deal with that, which will continue to contribute to every year. And then the churchyard, the costs for managing the churchyard rose to just over £10,000. That's now been very carefully managed and brought back within cost. So we would expect the cost of managing the grass to be around £4,000, and that leaves us well within the £6,000 that's given to us by Tewkesbury Borough Council to manage the grass, the trees, the walls, the footpaths, and the gravestones themselves. So for 2020, the cost drivers, well, I mentioned that the church income was down, so the lack of church services saw the cash and cheque income drop from just under £60,000 there to something closer to £12,000. What does that sort of drop include when we think about the numbers? Well, because we couldn't physically give during the services, mostly because people couldn't be in the services, and then of course because we've had a constraint on the number of people in there, that has really impacted people who like to physically donate every week. I've mentioned already that there was no gift day. Typically we raise around £12,000 for those events, and then of course the gift aid was also impacted because the extra 25% that we tend to be able to claim also wasn't available to be claimed because we didn't have the donations coming in. So the income was down around £47,000, as we've mentioned. We also lost, of course, occasional services. Those are the weddings and funerals. That was down by around £1,500. So the cash flow, the amount of money that comes through the church, was just around 11,000. But a lot of that money gets passed on either as a direct cost for things like the choir and organists, and even sometimes for ministers, versus the payments that we also make into the diocese. So when there's a wedding, there's a whole series of different bills that come through, and some of that money comes to the church, but not all of it. As you can tell, we estimated a loss of around £1,500. But it wasn't all bad news. We were buoyed up by £24,000 worth of alternate income. So we saw PGS increase, so thank you to everybody who stepped in to do that. And we had adopted electronic methods of donating, which helped because, of course, they were contactless and were sort of COVID compliant in that sense. So when people were in church, the electronic donations went up. And then the furlough scheme, the official job retention scheme in its various guises, we made use of that quite extensively, and we had an income of around £19,000. And to be honest, that is what kept us buoyant for quite a long period of the year, which you'll see shortly. So the bank balance. At the start, before COVID as COVID was really taking hold, we tended to have a balance of around £100,000. You can see how over time that steadily dropped. So furlough payments here kept us fairly buoyant at the start, but then as we reduced furlough into the autumn period, as things started to unlock, we saw our income continue to drop because we was paying, well, we always paid the full payroll, but the money we got back in to offset that payment and keeping people employed was reducing all the time. It was also that period of time that we saw quite a lot of phase 2 works happening. So the audiovisual equipment was installed over the summer with a large cost paid then, and the storage in the south transept was also installed over that period of time. So those were some fairly hefty costs. The money was all restricted, so it couldn't go to anything else. So we seized the opportunity to use those restricted funds when the church was relatively empty, and it would cause minimum disruption over that period of time. So the net effect, as we look at the drop, was to see that about a 50% decrease over the year in our bank balance, which is quite an impact for what we need, because generally we should have £50,000 of reserves in the accounts at all times. So our lowest zero, as it were, should be where this dotted line is, and you can see we are routinely beneath it. Looking into what is now the past, but at the time was the forecasting, we were quite concerned. So what we did is we looked at what the cash flow would look like, and we could see a continued reduction, and therefore that helped to inform the new fundraising targets that we established to help us avoid this sort of continual drop, because that would take us routinely beneath our £50,000 worth of reserves that we're meant to keep to hand, which is 3 months worth of outgoing money, and then we would have to sort of tackle this particular challenge. So the aim is to start climbing back up, but this is the future if we don't do anything about it, and don't try and set ourselves some challenging targets to meet. So the key message here is that our spending has to really match our income, or this picture itself will worsen, as we have over here in the purple. So to return to past spending, we're going to need to exceed our own targets, and I'll be able to talk a little bit about the measures we put in place to restabilise the finances. So the Get Well plan, this is detailed in the financial handbook, and the handbook should be available on the website. But step one was pretty simple: reduce your outgoing. So we were able to do a line-by-line review in late 2020, and then assess exactly where we could make savings. And in some cases, there are things that we stopped completely, and other areas where we applied some savings measures, so that we only spent about 70%, or forecast to spend 70% of what we routinely would. And these measures were implemented right at the beginning of 2021. So our forecast expenditure for 2021 is just over £200,000. Big difference in the two numbers there. So just over £200,000. Step two was to increase our income, because even though we had reduced our outgoings to just over £200,000, we still had an income that was forecast to be lower, because of course we were entering another lockdown at the beginning of this year. So the in-year deficit at the start of the year, the amount of money that we were short for in-year costs alone, was £32,000, and that feels like an enormous number to try and meet. But we are getting ahead with that, and we are starting to make a difference, and I'll be able to show you that in the next slide. For step 3, it's all about prioritisation, close monthly tracking of our income and expenditure, and making sure that we really focus on our priorities. And where there are opportunities to raise for particular activities, then we should seize those opportunities to minimise the impact, to make it sort of cost neutral to the PCC accounts. And then step 4, setting some pretty clear ambition. The handbook talks about the sorts of things we're going to get after. So we looked at what we were going to target for our increase in giving every month, the adoption of various digital mechanisms for giving. We were going to relentlessly pursue grants and be really quite bold in some of our mission work, because we want to set ourselves some challenging targets. I don't mind if we don't quite meet them, but the point is to be challenging with ourselves. So this represented the 4-step plan in the financial handbook, and that went quite some way to alleviate the challenges that we were going to experience and bring them into some sort of more manageable space. But you've got to bear in mind that that manageable space was still an in-year deficit of £32,000. So how is the financial situation looking right now? So this is a very detailed breakdown of where we are. So you can see that I look at the accounting period. So this is accurate to the end of May 2021. You can see all the different sorts of things that we get our money in from in that space. And you can actually see how much we should get in each year. So our income here is £217,000. And you can see on the other side here the sorts of things we spend our money on, and where the large ticket items are, mostly being around payroll, i.e. for our 4 employees and paying them, and then the parish share itself, which is our donation into the diocese. And those things pay for Malk and his property, and a percentage of Richard for our area, and help us to continue doing some of our ministry. So these are all things where we spend our money. So you can see there the number there is about £214,000. Now that deficit is actually closer to £27,000 as we've refined these numbers and tuned them. So that £32,000 that I labelled in the previous slide is actually slightly smaller. Now, year to date, looking all the way up to the end of May, you can see that our income totaled £91,000. That's what we needed it to be as far as the forecast was concerned. And in reality, our actual was £106,000. So we're doing about £15,000 better than we thought we would do at this stage. So that's really positive news. When I look at the forecasts for the expenditure, we should be spending just under £91,000, and right now we're spending just over £91,000. So that's not too bad. That's about £650 over what our target is. So the total difference at the moment is around £14,000, and actually you can see some of these numbers down here. Now, the number that I track quite closely every month and present to either the Standing Committee or to the PCC is our running deficit, which is how does that shortfall look like? So we thought it was 32,000. It's now, with increased accuracy, just over 27,000. And now actually, as we look at the situation today, it's about £12,500. So when we started on the 1st of January, our deficit actually got worse, into a space where I said, well, there are some pretty tough decisions here. We're going to have to make some really big choices. But actually, after a bit of effort, we were able to see it grow quite significantly up in the 1st of March. And these things move around. So it then dropped back in April, but it was still dropping back to a place that was better than where we started. And then in May, it sprang forwards again to this point. And instead of actually dropping backwards again, we found that it increased slightly in June. And that was partly because of a lot of grant and fundraising money that had happened associated with the chimes, which actually is almost transparent to these numbers, because all of the money was raised from external sources rather than taking money from our reserves. So we are able to get that repair done quickly, which allows us to really focus the gift day on supporting our mission activities and our outreach activities. So hopefully there's, for those of you who are interested, a bit of clarity there in what's going on in terms of the big numbers. If I was to say, one message that you should take away from this slightly complicated looking spreadsheet is that actually we have been able to tackle over half of the deficit that we thought we were starting with at the start of the year. And that's really important, because being down here at the start of the year was quite a big challenge. But now that we moved up here, as we approach the middle of the year, we just have to close this gap. And the aspiration really is to go straight through this zero and start moving into this space where we're into green again, because then the reserve is being built back up. We have financial choice and options. Our ministry and outreach is becoming really quite well supported financially, and that we can demonstrate that we have been able to overcome the financial impact, at least, of COVID-19 and that situation. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of clarity on the situation with the finances and allows you to ask some questions at the APCM. So thank you for your time. That's where I conclude the presentation, and I've just managed to keep it to 15 minutes. So I hope you've been able to take that information in, and it's been useful to you. Thank you.